Halloween is supposed to be harmless. Cheap masks, laughing kids, porch lights glowing like little promises. But on October 31st, 2010, behind the polished doors of a mansion in Ascot, Berkshire, on a street so wealthy it's nicknamed Millionaires Row, a different ritual played out. Joanna Simpson, 46, was attacked with a claw hammer while her children played just 2 doors away. Outside, neighbors handed out sweets. Inside, someone who once vowed to love her was already thinking about a grave he'd prepared months earlier. And the most chilling part? The man who did it was a British Airways captain, trusted in the sky, lethal on the ground. Joanna Simpson's story didn't begin with blood. It began with warmth. Yorkshire roots, a close family, and a woman people described as a ray of sunshine. Born in 1964 in York, she grew up with strong values and a bright, restless energy. Friends remembered her as a live wire, someone who threw herself into life and somehow made everyone around her feel safer, seen, and cared for. She studied business at the University of Bath, built a successful career, and later chose the role she loved most, being a mother. Joanna believed children deserved a secure home, a stable world, a life where love wasn't conditional. She didn't miss birthdays. She showed up. She listened. She gave her energy freely. Even her home reflected who she was. In Ascot, she bought a house that was practically collapsing, so neglected that trees had started pushing through the roof. But Joanna rebuilt it herself, turning something broken into something beautiful. That detail matters because it reveals a pattern. She wasn't someone who gave up. She fixed things. She stayed hopeful. She believed effort could transform chaos into comfort. Then came Robert Brown. They met in South Africa in late 1998. He was a British Airways captain flying long-haul routes, Hong Kong, Los Angeles, San Francisco, commanding Boeing 747s. The job carried status, authority, and a kind of charm that can feel like certainty. He was confident, persuasive, used to being listened to. Their relationship, people later said, hit like a storm. Intense, dramatic, consuming. He moved into her Ascot home. On Christmas Day, 1998, while in Hong Kong for work, he proposed in a grand romantic gesture. Joanna said yes. They married on February 13, 1999. But the warning signs didn't wait politely at the door. Joanna's parents disliked him almost immediately, describing him as rude, cocky, dismissive. Friends noticed he could be cold, controlling, unpleasant around her circle. Joanna seemed calmer when he wasn't present, as if his absence allowed her to breathe. Her father was so concerned he insisted she sign a prenuptial agreement protecting her assets, including the home she had bought and rebuilt. Robert resented it. He signed, but it bruised his pride, and pride, when mixed with entitlement, can become a very dangerous fuel. The honeymoon should have been a soft beginning. Instead, Joanna called her mother from Cape Town and said marrying Robert was a mistake. Imagine that moment. Newly married, far away, and already afraid. 2 months later, she was pregnant. That pregnancy became a trap disguised as a blessing. Not because the children weren't loved, but because leaving now would mean tearing open a war she wasn't sure she could survive. Their son Alex was born in December 1999. Their daughter Katie followed in May 2001. Joanna adored them. She shaped her life around them, stepping away from work to become what she called a hands-on mother. She also built a 5-star bed and breakfast business that allowed her to remain present at school runs and bedtimes. Robert had invested money into it, later a point of bitterness, but Joanna's focus was always the children. And yet, within the marriage, the cracks widened. Robert returned from long-haul trips and didn't rejoin family life. He chased career progress, stayed late, stayed distant, and left Joanna to carry the emotional and practical weight alone. The house might have looked perfect from the outside. Ascot, success, a pilot husband, but inside, the pattern was forming. Isolation, control, fear, and silence. By 2007, Joanna was exhausted. 8 years of tension can teach a person to shrink their needs just to keep the peace, but peace was never what Robert wanted. When he accused her, falsely, of having an affair, it became a trigger point. Joanna spoke to a lawyer. Quietly, cautiously, she began to imagine escape. But Robert didn't respond like someone losing a relationship. He responded like someone losing ownership. While on a work trip in Hong Kong, Robert called her and described bad thoughts, violent fantasies about killing Joanna and the children with an axe, then crashing a plane to kill himself. That call wasn't just disturbing. It was a psychological weapon. It forced Joanna into the role of caretaker for his darkness, as if she was responsible for preventing the catastrophe he was describing. Fear like that doesn't always send victims to the police. Often it sends them into silence because they can sense something that outsiders don't, that reporting might escalate the danger. Then came the knife incident, an event that should have ended everything, but instead became another secret Joanna had to carry. One night in mid-2007, after she came home with the children, Robert's jealousy ignited. In the kitchen, he wrapped an arm around her neck and pressed a knife into her chest. Joanna didn't scream. She calculated. She chose words carefully, the way people do when they're negotiating for their life. She managed to de-escalate him, and when she finally told him the truth, that she could no longer be with him, his response was chillingly practical. She could leave, but she couldn't take the children. That was the trap. Not love, not marriage. Custody as control. A threat designed to keep her compliant. Joanna still didn't go to the police. People often ask why, as if fear is a simple emotion. But Joanna wasn't just afraid of a man. She was afraid of what a man like Robert, powerful, confident, respected, could do if exposed. She was afraid of retaliation. She was afraid of not being believed. She was afraid of the children being used as leverage. And so she tried to exit in the safest way she could, separation. Robert moved out to a house in Winkfield, but the nightmare didn't end. It simply changed shape. Over the next 3.5 years, the divorce became a battleground. The prenuptial agreement, intended as protection, turned into Robert's obsession. He believed he was owed money, especially because he had contributed financially to Joanna's business. He framed it as injustice. But what it really represented to him was humiliation, the law recognizing Joanna as an independent person with boundaries he couldn't break. And that's when the surveillance started. Wires for CCTV were cut. Security lighting stopped working after wires were cut. Records revealed purchases of spy equipment. Robert admitted to buying a tracking device intended for Joanna's car. This wasn't just bitterness. It was monitoring, trying to keep her within range, within sight, within reach. Joanna tried to buy time and safety with agreements. He wouldn't come to the house for 6 months, then another 6. She believed freedom was near. Friends said that even when she sounded low, she kept pushing forward. She had her children. She had hope. She had a finish line. But sometimes the finish line is exactly what a controlling person cannot tolerate. On October 20th, 2010, the UK Supreme Court delivered a ruling in a major case, Radmacher v. Granatino, emphasizing that prenuptial agreements should carry significant weight. For Joanna, it felt like protection finally becoming real. For Robert, it felt like defeat becoming permanent. And with a final divorce hearing scheduled for November 8th, just 1 week after Halloween, Joanna believed she was almost free. She didn't realize Robert was counting down too, just not to a courtroom. October 31st, 2010. Ascot on Halloween. Costumes, sweets, doorbells ringing. A night built around pretend fear. Meanwhile, real fear walked through the front door of Toon Cottage carrying something hidden in a child's school bag. Around 4 p.m., Robert arrived to return Alex and Katie from their half-term visit. The children, around 9 and 10, ran inside, excited, loud with love, carrying the innocence of kids who assume parents will always protect them. They went to the playroom. 2 doors away, in a private part of the house, their mother was about to die. Robert had not come empty-handed. Hidden in the bag was a weapon, an axe tucked away earlier, concealed among ordinary items meant for school. And planning wasn't limited to what he carried. Months before, he had dug a grave in Windsor Great Park. He had purchased supplies, A large plastic storage box, bin bags, tape. Tools not for impulse, but for disposal. The preparation changes everything. It turns a killing into a project. Robert and Joanna argued. He would later offer flimsy explanations, but no argument justifies what came next. In the bedroom, he attacked Joanna with a claw hammer. 14 strikes, delivered with force and repetition. Joanna fought back. Defensive wounds cut her hands and arms. She tried to protect herself, tried to escape, tried to stay alive. But Robert was taller, stronger, and determined. This was not an accident. It was an execution dressed up as a domestic dispute. And the children heard enough to sense something was wrong. Katie, young but perceptive, later asked her father a question that burns into the record. Was he going to call an ambulance? He didn't. Not once. He had no intention of saving her. The judge would later emphasize this. There was no rescue plan, only a cover-up plan. Robert moved with chilling speed. He covered Joanna's body with plastic sheeting and carried her to the car. Katie saw him load her mother into the boot. Imagine the confusion of that moment. A child watching something impossible, trying to fit it into a story that makes sense. Robert told the children their mother was sick and needed the hospital. Children don't have the luxury of suspicion. They have dependency. So they went with him. At about 4:20 p.m., 20 minutes after the murder, he drove back to his home in Winkfield with the children, Joanna's body still in the boot. He brought the kids inside, let them sit with fear they couldn't name, then left again. He drove to Windsor Great Park, to the grave he'd prepared months earlier, and buried Joanna. He had the spade nearby. He buried the hammer and even disposed of CCTV equipment, scattering evidence like a man trying to erase the reality he had created. Outside, Halloween continued. Neighbors laughed. Streets filled with children collecting sweets. Not far away, a woman lay underground in a park, placed there by the man who once promised to cherish her. Robert then delivered the children to his girlfriend, Stephanie, for the night. She said something was wrong. He was tense, evasive, off. She contacted his family. His brother Kenneth phoned police, worried. And then, in a move that reveals Robert's mindset, Robert himself called police at 8:38 a.m. the next morning, reporting a major domestic incident. It sounded like cooperation, but it was strategy, shaping the narrative, creating an entry point that made him look controlled rather than hunted. Police arrived at Toon Cottage and forced entry when no one answered. Inside, they found a scene so bloody forensic officers later called it one of the worst they'd ever seen. Blood on floors, walls, ceiling, bedroom. But Joanna was gone. Her phone, purse, car remained. The woman did not. At 10:11 a.m., Robert walked into Maidenhead Police Station and was arrested. Investigators thought he would break, that he'd reveal where she was. Instead, he used silence like a weapon, no comment again and again, stretching time while Joanna's family lived inside a nightmare of not knowing. The days after Joanna's disappearance carried a strange, almost supernatural cruelty. Everyone could feel she was gone, but the world couldn't prove it yet. Her mother, Diana, lived in that unbearable limbo. Hope and dread braided together so tightly they felt like one emotion. Search teams combed woods and parks, dogs and helicopters scanning what looked like ordinary landscapes. And there's something eerie about that. How a place can look peaceful while hiding the worst truth a family can face. Trees swaying, leaves falling, the quiet doing what quiet does, pretending nothing happened. Robert, meanwhile, sat in custody and played a long game. Interviewed repeatedly, he refused to answer. When he did speak, he painted himself as a victim of a nasty breakup, blaming the prenuptial agreement, portraying Joanna as controlling and wealthy and cruel. But investigators recognized the pattern. The prenup wasn't his excuse. It was his motive, not because of money alone, but because it symbolized a boundary he couldn't break. Then, on November 3rd, something shifted. Police confronted Robert with images of the blood evidence. Reality, captured and undeniable. After consulting his lawyer, Robert finally produced a single-page statement, carefully measured, stripped of emotion, almost administrative. He claimed there had been a fight, that he pushed Joanna, that he put her in the boot and planned to take her to hospital. Then he admitted what mattered. Yeah, her body was in Windsor Great Park. Even that admission carried a cold kind of control. He hadn't led police there out of remorse. He led them there because evidence was closing in. And still, he had used days of silence, days that can't be returned to a family whose world had already collapsed. On November 4th, police took Robert to Windsor Great Park. He guided them straight to the spot without hesitation. No searching, no uncertainty. He knew exactly where she was because the grave wasn't a panic choice. It was part of a plan. Forensic teams recovered Joanna's body on November 5th, 5 days after burial. The grave was shallow, near Sand Hill Road, close to a drainage tunnel, an ordinary piece of geography that now carried a permanent stain. In court, the case revealed what felt like a grim checklist of preparation. The grave dug months in advance, the weapon hidden in a child's school bag, the plastic storage box ready, the disposal of the hammer and CCTV equipment, the absence of any attempt to call for help, a child asking for an ambulance, and being ignored. These details didn't just suggest intention, they screamed it. Yet, the legal outcome became its own haunting mystery. How can planning look so clear and the verdict still avoid the word murder? In May 2011, Robert Brown pleaded not guilty to murder, but guilty to manslaughter, arguing diminished responsibility. The trial became a collision between evidence and interpretation. The prosecution pointed to planning and concealment. The defense leaned into mental state. And in a devastating turn, certain testimony, especially aspects of Katie's account, did not reach the jury in a way Joanna's family believed it should have. Outside the courtroom, the public expected a straightforward conclusion. Inside, law moved like fog. Technical, careful, sometimes disconnected from the raw moral clarity the world felt in its bones. When the verdict arrived, not guilty of murder, guilty of manslaughter, shock rippled through the room. People cried. Gasps broke out. Diana Parks called it a gross miscarriage of justice, saying he had got away with murder in name. Robert received a long sentence, but under UK rules, he could potentially be released after serving half. For Joanna's loved ones, that possibility felt like a second violation, an aftershock that never stopped trembling. And here is where the story takes on a different kind of mystical force. Joanna's absence became a presence. Her death did not stay buried in the park. It rose into policy discussions, into public awareness, into a growing movement against domestic abuse. When people say a person lives on, it can sound like a comforting cliché. But in this case, it took a literal form, a foundation, a campaign, a national conversation shaped by the woman whose voice was taken, yet somehow still echoed through the country. The most condemning truth of Joanna Simpson's case is not just that she was killed, it's how many warnings existed, how much planning was evident, and how easily the system can struggle to name what is plainly in front of it. This wasn't a sudden loss of control on Halloween night. This was a slow build. Threats on the phone about killing her and the children, a knife pressed in her chest, years of surveillance behavior, a divorce weaponized into a war, and then, most damning, an actual grave dug months in advance. A grave is not an emotion. A grave is logistics. A grave is decision. And then there were the children. They were in the next room. Katie heard enough to know something was wrong. She asked about an ambulance. She saw her mother's body placed into the boot. Those details matter because they strip away any last refuge of, I didn't mean it. There was time to stop, time to call for help, time to choose a different path. He chose none of those. He chose concealment, speed, and narrative management. Robert Brown wasn't a stranger in a dark alley. He was a commercial pilot, someone entrusted with hundreds of lives, trained to stay calm under pressure, trained to follow procedures, trained to act responsibly in emergencies. That contrast is sickening. The same man who could guide a plane safely through the sky refused to make a simple emergency call when his children begged, directly or indirectly, for their mother's help. His calm after the act wasn't shock. It was control. The legal outcome is where condemnation burns hottest. A verdict of manslaughter on diminished responsibility, despite preparation, felt to Joanna's family like the system choosing a comfortable label over a truthful one. The public doesn't struggle to understand 14 hammer blows. The public doesn't struggle to understand a grave dug months earlier. The public understands intent when it sees it. But courts are not built to satisfy moral instincts. They're built to test legal thresholds. And sometimes that gap between moral reality and legal conclusion becomes a wound that never closes. The aftermath exposed another failure: how domestic abuse is often treated as private, even when it is clearly escalating. Joanna didn't report the knife attack. Many victims don't. Fear is not a character flaw. It's a survival strategy. But when victims stay silent, abusers grow bolder. And when systems don't recognize patterns early, coercive control, stalking behaviors, threats, monitoring, violence gets a head start. Joanna's mother, Diana Parks, refused to let the story end in that courtroom. She turned grief into relentless pressure, helping establish the Joanna Simpson Foundation to support children impacted by domestic abuse and to push for systemic change. That is the second condemnation. Families should not have to build institutions just to patch holes the system already knows exist. They do it because they have no other choice. The fight didn't stop with the sentence. When the possibility of Robert's release approached, public outcry reignited. Survivors, advocates, and Joanna's family pushed back hard, arguing that release would endanger public safety and re-traumatize those already harmed. Government officials intervened to delay release, and legal battles followed. The fact that a man connected to such calculated brutality could ever be automatically released tells you something uncomfortable about how sentencing frameworks can fail to reflect the reality of coercive, planned violence in the home. Joanna should not be remembered only for her death. But we must be honest about what her death reveals. Domestic violence isn't a couple's issue. It's a public safety crisis. It hides behind respectability, uniforms, careers, status, nice neighborhoods. It thrives on disbelief. He doesn't seem like that. And when it escalates, it doesn't just destroy one life. It fractures children, families, communities. The final condemnation belongs to the idea that this was inevitable. It wasn't. There were warning shots for years. The tragedy is not only that Robert killed Joanna. The tragedy is that the world had enough signals to fear it might happen. And still, it happened anyway. Joanna Simpson didn't die because Halloween was dangerous. She died because control was. A man planned her burial before he ended her life, then hid behind silence and legal shadows. Her children lived through it, her family fought through it, and the system was forced to look in the mirror. Her legacy is a warning. Monsters can wear uniforms,